Wow, day 5. I'm a little late because I got up late. Also, I just showered. Um, but we're on page. Oh boy, it's bad that I forget the page I'm on every time. My bookmark fell out. Um, so I don't know if anyone's gonna join today because I didn't tell anyone I was gonna do it 3 hours late. But oh well. Sorry. Hmm. Sorry, I didn't. I really should have remembered where we are. I think this is it. At night, when the other students on his floor began to roughhouse, Moses would quietly close the door. Alone in his room, he would write poems, dreamy-eyed romances, and imitations of Walter Pater and Swinburne, and he would read. When he found a subject that interested him, he would clear the library shelves of books on the subject, lug them back to his room, stack them on his desk, and read through the stack until it was finished. Ironically, it was the reading and writing he did behind the door closed against his classmates' shouts that first made them take an interest in him. There was, on the campuses of that era, a respect for scholarliness and brilliance, and Bob Moses's classmates slowly began to realize the extent to which he possessed these qualities. One of the members of the Mohegan Lake Suite says, I liked Bob from the first, but in the beginning, it was sort of a paternal feeling. When he'd come around to the door, sorry, the train's going by. When he'd come around to the room, he'd seem so young and lost. But then I began to be attracted to him for his mind. I loved Latin, and I got very high marks in it. But I knew just enough Latin to know that Bob was on a level way above mine. He really knew Latin. I started talking to him, and I became aware of a quality of mind that was exceptional. He was brilliant. I liked talking to him, and I became friendly with him. And that was what happened between Moses and a lot of people. By the end of sophomore year or the beginning of junior year, people were beginning to talk about him. He became admired for his scholarship, and all of a sudden, we noticed he was coming around to our suite less and less. He had gotten friends of his own. Moses began to submit his poetry for publication, not to the famous Yale Literary Magazine, where Leonard Bacon and cadaverous, freckle-faced, red-haired Sinclair Lewis were among the classmates competing for places on the board, but to a newer, less prestigious publication, the Yale Current. Encouraged by the acceptance of a poem for the December 1907 issue, he contributed more poems and several short stories. And when, in March 1908, the new Current editorial board was selected, he was on it. He also joined the Yale swimming team. Swimming occupied approximately the same position in relation to other sports at Yale as the Current did to the Lit. Intercollegiate competition in the sports had begun only a few years before, and few colleges had swimming teams. A highlight of meets was still an event called the plunge for distance, in which the winner was the competitor who, after diving in the pool, could travel the farthest without moving his arms and legs. I'm gonna have to look that up. At Yale, the team practiced in an ancient, dank, low-ceilinged, too-short pool only 3 times a week. The Yale Daily News reported the results of the meets, when it reported them at all, at the very end of the list of sports results. And after even fencing and wrestling, and thanks to the influence of Walter Camp, who felt that the famous Yale Y should be worn only by football, hockey, and baseball players, he wasn't too sure about hockey and baseball. Swimmers were eligible only for a YSA, an insignia standing for Yale Swimming Association. She looks so crabby. Moses joined the swimming team as a sophomore. If he ever won a race, the victory was not reported in the news. But he knew he was known as a hard worker in practice and a fierce competitor in meets. And he knew he could be counted upon for second or third place points in either the 50-yard or the 100-yard crawl. As a junior, Moses was elected manager, an honor which entitled him to arrange meets and buy the team's train tickets. Swimming and the current enabled Bob Moses to broaden his acquaintance at Yale, and the classmates who got to know him began to see something special in the tall, slim Jew from New York, very handsome in the required high, round collar, who had the huge emotional eyes and earnest, passionate manner of the idealist, the poet, the lover. In the phrase they learned in a popular course on Walter Pierce, of the good, the true, and the beautiful. The eyes and the manner these classmates learned were not misleading. Not only was Bob Moses a poet, but his poems were poems, like the dreamy-eyed Song of the Arctic Nereid, a hymn on the nymphs of the sea, or fragments from the French. Fair night, afar the day has fled. Fair night, a torch divine o'erhead. And then the rest of the poem. And the idealism was deep. Not only had Bob Moses read most of Pater, he believed in what he had read. He loved learning genuinely and for its own sake. If he was competitive in swimming, he wasn't in classroom work. He wasn't uninterested in marks, but he wasn't especially concerned about them either. He spent night after night behind a closed door reading, but his friends began to realize that the reading was not for grades. Sometimes they would look at the stack of books on his desk, and not one of them had anything to do with the courses he was taking. They were there because they interested him, and their subjects covered a wide spectrum of knowledge. If Moses seemed particularly fascinated by literature and history, he was also reading everything he could find on the history of art. One of his friends was taking German. He came across a phrase one day that seemed to fit Bob Moses. Durstig Geist. Moses did indeed, the friends say, have a thirsty mind. After his sophomore year, one of his new friends went with Moses to Europe. Hello, I know, I'm sorry I'm late. I slept in. Please forgive me. All you missed is him at Yale making friends and reading a lot. Okay. Moses' great enthusiasm was reserved for a more famous work of art, the Mona Lisa. He seemed riveted to the floor of the Louvre in front of the painting. When he got back to Yale in the fall, he wrote poems about it, including one apparently done in the style of Swinburne's Dolores that called her Our Lady Divine. Oh, and I missed a paragraph about how he went to Europe before the Great War. He spent his 8 weeks abroad. In literature, his greatest enthusiasm was for Samuel Johnson. Chauncey Brewster Tinker, a young professor whose empathy for Johnson's era was reflected in an almost 18th century courtesy and insistence on form, but whose austerity was burned away on the lecture platform by what one colleague called the white fire of the poet, made his Johnson and his Circle course a journey into a beautiful and exciting country. Wandering off on his own, Bob Moses explored that country's byways. The assigned reading included excerpts from Boswell's biography of Johnson. Moses read the book complete, became interested in biography, and proceeded to read stacks of biographies as well as books on the nature of that genre. His friends began to see that Moses' idealism was not confined to the printed page. If the more perceptive members of his class realized that democracy of talent was a false description of life at Yale, Moses had specific ideas on how to make the slogan a reality. The suggestion that class officers be chosen on merit rather than the basis of fraternity membership was not the only remedy for Yale's social ossification, which Moses proposed, both in late evening bull sessions and in the current. He was also, for instance, insistent that some sort of that's a tongue twister, that some sort of social recognition should be given for scholastic achievement. And in at least one instance, he proved his willingness to fight for his ideals. Moses not only enjoyed swimming himself, he was convinced that the sport should receive more emphasis at Yale because, as a classmate put it, he regarded it as something in which every undergraduate could take pleasure, as contrasted with the gladiatorial sports like football and baseball. He had the same feeling about other minor sports such as tennis, track, golf, gymnastics, fencing, shooting, and wrestling, all of which had, like swimming, been only recently incorporated into the intercollegiate athletic scene. His enthusiasm about them reached such a peak, in fact, that his friends jokingly began to call him the minor sport. I have to plug in my computer. I hope everyone's having a good morning. I had a good morning. It was nice to sleep in. I slept in so late. I didn't get out of bed till like 11. Okay. Also, in case you're wondering, right beneath me right now is a really good reading buddy who loves to sit in my lap. I wish I could get her in the shot better. I'm just like, okay. Okay, much better. Much better. Great. So they jokingly called him minor sport. Her name is Pearl. Every attempt to upgrade such sports at Yale had run head-on into the frenzy over football. It was the era when gridiron heroes like Ted Coy and Tad Jones were the campus gods, when the winner of the Big Three title was national champion, when every victory was celebrated with bonfires and torchlight parades down Chapel Street, and into the personal opposition of Camp, who, in addition to being first among the Eli football pantheon, had the more practical advantage of being the treasurer of the athletic union. With the Yale Bowl that was his dream drawing ever closer to reality, Camp had been squirreling away the annual surplus of the union with such enthusiasm that it had already reached over $120,000. And he was not about to turn any of it over to the sports he derided. And Ed Camp is the sports guy at Yale. Sports executive. Bearding Camp, I think. Bearding Camp in his suite at the New Haven house, Moses suggested a distribution of some of the football surplus among the minor sports. Bearding Camp in his suite at the New Haven house, Moses suggested a distribution of some of the football surplus among the minor sports. Camp flatly refused to give a nickel. Another undergraduate might have left quietly. Recalling the scene, Moses was to say, "What you have to understand is what a colossal influence he had. He dominated all of the athletics there. His word was absolutely law." But this undergraduate, before leaving, told Camp that someday the minor sports would be just as important on the intercollegiate scene as baseball and hockey. And although Camp treated the prediction as kind of a joke, he was soon to stop laughing, for Moses refused to let the matter drop. In editorials in the Current and the Yale Daily News, Moses attacked with a directness unusual in college publications of the day, pointing out that almost as many men participated in minor as in major sports. Moses accused Yale's football managers, a euphemism understood perfectly by the Yale community, of being unjust to one half of Yale athletics. Camp let it be known that he was personally offended. The editorials continued. Dean Baldy White called Moses to his office for a friendly but pointed discussion. The editorials continued. And when Moses came up with a plan to create a minor sports association that would hold a single fundraising drive, raise $3,500, and through an executive committee composed of the sports managers, distribute it among the various teams according to their needs, the dean hastily gave the association permission to appeal to alumni for contributions, and also brought back word of a concession from Camp that was small but significant, coming from a man who had previously run Yale athletics without making any concessions at all. If the Minor Sports Association raised $3,200, Camp's athletic union would contribute the other $300. Persuading the minor sports to combine into one association, which meant turning over their finances to an outside body, proved almost as difficult as persuading Camp. Hockey and basketball, which were classed among these sports but were popular enough among students so that their managers could generally raise money by a door-to-door appeal on campus, were particularly reluctant. Yet because hockey and basketball were the only two of the minor sports in which there was much interest, their participation was essential. Moses argued that even for hockey and basketball, the existence of a formal association would make it much easier to obtain money from alumni and students who had treated it as a joke. The many separate appeals from the different minor sports. And the idealist also argued on higher grounds. In one editorial, he wrote, "As far as basketball and hockey are considered per se, they have nothing to gain. But there must be sacrifice on the part of the basketball and hockey teams for the sake of common good." Hockey and basketball agreed to join. The other sports followed. On June 11, 1908, Moses was able to announce the formation of the Yale University Minor Sports Association. With Moses organizing its fund drives, the association proved to be more vigorous than Camp had expected. When he realized the extent of its fundraising efforts among alumni, traditional fountainhead of football funds, Moses was called in by Dean Wright and advised to be calm and dignified. Any undue pressure on alumni, he was warned, would result in the withdrawal of the $300 offer. Moses promptly made the threat public in the Current and announced that the fundraising would continue. Moses' friends and men on campus who had previously hardly noticed him were impressed by his courage. 60 years after he graduated, one member of the swimming team could recall that the report was that he and Camp had quite a go at it. "We thought it was quite a thing." Moses' idealism began to be talked about widely in the class, and it was because of this that Ed Richards was all the more surprised when, on a day in January 1909, he climbed out of the pool after doing laps and heard what Moses was suggesting about Og Reed. After I had, and that's a reference to the first page where he was saying that he was going to go. Sorry, that's the M train. Moses wanted to go into town and get a guy to donate without telling him it was a minor sports association, so it's kind of misleading. And then the swim team captain was like, "No, you can't lie to someone about where their money's going." And then he was like, "Well, I'm going to do it, otherwise I'm going to quit." And then the swim team captain was like, "Okay, then quit." And then he did. That happened on the first page. Okay, quote, "After I had accepted his resignation," Richards, the captain, recalls, "he began to put pressure on me to take him back on the team and let him go ahead with his approach to Reed. He managed to work up an amazing amount of pressure. He really was very clever about it. He got the managers of the other minor sports to send a delegation to me to talk me out of it. I told them, no, it's not an honest way to treat Og Reed. He's always treated us very nicely." Then Bob went to the man who was the heart and soul of swimming at Yale, Maxie Swartz. Maxie was really just the janitor at the pool, but he was a good old guy. He took a lot of interest in the swimmers, and he was always around the team. Bob got Maxie to ask me to take him back. He had Maxie tell me, "Oh, Reed has plenty of money. He'll never miss a little of it." But I talked it over with a few other guys on the team, and they said I was right, and I refused Maxie too. Although Richards' firmness terminated Moses' connection with Yale athletics, his activity in more esoteric areas of campus life continued. Moses' interest in art and poetry had made him a member of 1909's little clique of intellectuals and aesthetes, and to some extent, he was becoming its leader. He was active in the Current. He may not have been invited to join any of the more important clubs at Yale, but he became president of the one he did join, the Kit Kat Club, a new organization which was named after the group of convivial literary spirits who had surrounded Samuel Johnson, and which included Yale men who have shown literary ability and interest in literary subjects. During his senior year, he and a classmate published Yale Verse, an anthology of the best undergraduate poetry of the previous 10 years. Moses' academic work continued to be outstanding. A half-century after he graduated, a professor recalled, "I well remember Robert Moses in my classes. He was alert, enthusiastic, very active, always doing A work. He was a model student. It was the energy of the man and his very great intelligence that I remember most clearly. Seniors were awarded premiums, small cash awards established by alumni for outstanding work. Moses won a handful for math and English and Latin. In English composition for an essay on the Mona Lisa, besides making Phi Beta Kappa." Though Moses had lived alone during his first 2 years at Yale, in his last two he had roommates. As a senior, Raymond P. McNulty and Elias 5A Johnson. I didn't come to this, Johnson recalls. He approached me and asked me to room with him. Of course, I was glad to. We had been friendly before. But I think the fact that he approached me is an indication of a tendency I noticed in Bob. He selected his friends. The friends Bob Moses selected were of a specific type: cultured, artistic, interested in the things he was interested in, many of them members of the tight little circle that included members of Kit Kat and The Current. They included Malcolm T. Doherty, who had already displayed the talent that was to make him a prominent painter of marine life. Don't know him. Class poets like Bacon, Carl Thurston, and Ed Proctor. And current and lit contributors like James McConaughey, later governor of Connecticut, and Harold Phelps Stokes, later the chief editorial writer of the New York Herald Tribune. Johnson, a very poor boy from Chicago attending Yale on a scholarship, was perhaps Moses's closest friend. He had already earned a reputation as the class brain, and if Moses loved to read, 5A loved to study. Night after night, the two men would retire immediately after supper to their living room in Whitehall and stay at their desks until midnight or 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, when they'd take long walks, which usually ended at a little all-night luncheonette, which served the turn-of-the-century equivalent of the late-night evening hamburger, a heaping bowl of cornflakes and milk. In honor of Johnson's slimness, he carried 120 pounds on a 5'7" frame. Moses gave him a new nickname, Slat. On weekends, he often took Slat home to the apartment Bella and Emmanuel had rented in 1906 in a large apartment house at the corner of Central Park West and 70th Street, coming down to New York by train and across town from the station by horse-drawn streetcars. To while away time on trips, the boys would play an early version of 20 Questions, Ask Me Another, but Johnson, despite his 5 A's, confessed himself hopelessly outclassed. Bob had the damnedest questions on art and poetry and whatnot through the ages, he would recall. His reading was fantastic. His circle of friends liked and admired Bob Moses. He was always glad to see you, one says. He really liked you, and you liked him. He might love to read, but he was certainly no greasy grind. He enjoyed jokes, telling them and hearing them, and he had a quick, infectious laugh. Tall and strong, he enjoyed running and mountain climbing, once leading several friends to the top of Whiteface Mountain in the Adirondacks. He and Johnson might spend most evenings studying, but on some evenings they would walk along Chapel Street, where the townies, New Haven girls who were not averse to meeting Yale boys, paraded. And Moses was notably successful at striking up conversations, much to the discomfort of the painfully shy Slat. I remember that one night when we were reading, Bob suddenly jumped up and said, "Come on, let's take a walk," Slat recalls. We went down Chapel Street, and there were a couple of girls ahead of us, and he made some kind of remark, and they started laughing. I got afraid, and we went back to the room, but he walked off with them. I got afraid and walked back to the room, but he walked off with them. What his friends admired most was his idealism. Sometimes it took rather odd forms. One night, he and the scrawny Johnson had an argument that escalated into a short but violent fight, and Moses showed no hesitation in knocking, sprawling a man so much smaller than he. But once Johnson was down, Moses helped him up and, shaking his hand, congratulated him on his courage in fighting someone bigger and stronger. In discussions about campus life, however, Moses was more consistent. His appeals for true democracy at Yale continued. The argument about which fraternity's nominee should be given the class officer was one example. Johnson was trying to convince a group of classmates of the right of his fraternity to the job when Moses suddenly jumped up and, in Johnson's recollection, bawled the living daylights out of me. He was saying things like, "What does the fraternity have to do with it? It should be on the basis of ability." But it wasn't so much what he said as the way he said it. You could see that he was speaking from the heart. Sorry. You could see the honesty coming through in what he was saying. And all of a sudden, I was ashamed. Of course, I saw he was right. Why should money or influence or who a guy's friends were matter? When bull session discussions turned to careers after college, Moses said he was going to go into public service. His friends to be turning to a more active role. He wanted, he told them, to help the underprivileged, the lower classes, the people ground down by forces beyond their control. These phrases were not unusual ones among college seniors, but Moses' friends were impressed by the intensity, the evident deep belief with which he spoke them. As Moses' acquaintances expanded, moreover, so did the admiration. When, during his senior year, his class held elections for the 7-member senior council, the winners were 6 fraternity men and Bob Moses, who, with 59 votes, came in third. Other barriers could not be breached, of course. As graduation neared, 1909 elected its socially prestigious Class Day committees. Moses was elected to neither the class supper committee, the senior prom committee, the cap and gown committee, nor to any of the 16 other committees selected. By the time the class graduated, 45 men were in the senior societies, 100 in the junior fraternities, 51 in the sophomore societies, and Moses was not one of them. He never lived in Vanderbilt Hall. And to many of the men who did live in Vanderbilt and who did participate in the secret ceremonies of Skull and Bones or Wolf's Head, the honors that Robert Moses did achieve were unimportant. Frankly, says one of them in accents ancestral, I couldn't tell you what the Kit Kat Club was, or the Senior Council. When 1909 voted for its outstanding members, Moses received only a few scattered votes as brightest, most scholarly, and done most for Yale. In the official class history, which listed the rosters of clubs and committees and their outstanding members, his name hardly appeared at all. But what was, perhaps, significant about Bob Moses in the class history was not that his name appeared in it infrequently, but that it appeared in it at all. His achievements at Yale might be dim beside those of the prep school Episcopalian leaders of the secret societies. But they were bright indeed for a Jew. If in his first 2 years at Yale, Bob Moses had been a lonely nobody, in his last 2 years he had become considerably more than that. And the way in which he had become more was, in light of his later career, even more significant. He became a campus figure partly, of course, because of the brilliance and idealism that were part of his inheritance. He displayed also in his refusal to knuckle under to Walter Camp, his inherited stubbornness, and a considerable amount of real moral courage. But in the light of his later career, what is most interesting is that when he realized that, because of the handicap of his religion, his brilliance and idealism would not take him to the top of the world at Yale. He made within Yale a world of his own, and a world, moreover, in which, in collegiate terms, he had power and influence. He never went out for the lit, but he made himself an important member of the staff of a less prestigious publication. He never went out for a major sport, but he was active in a minor one. He was never invited to join one of the better clubs, but he was president of the lesser club he did join. And if he was not included in the more select social circles of the class, he created a circle of his own, a small coterie of persons with like interests, a coterie within which he was the acknowledged leader. The men in the coterie admired Bob Moses. The men he chose to be his friends were happy to be chosen. Alongside the massive cathedrals of Yale's traditions, buttressed by prejudice and pride, Bob Moses had erected his own small but sturdy structure. In our little world, Bacon was to say, he made himself a position of power. In the light of Moses' later career, that was the key point. Okay, I'm going to stop there. It's page 48 is where we're ending, and it's very cleanly on a new chapter, so I won't have trouble finding my spot. Thanks for coming. Everyone say goodbye to Pearl, and I hope you have a good day. I don't know if I'll do this tomorrow. Actually, no, I'm not going to do this tomorrow because I have to get up and go. I have to be up at Columbia University at 9 a.m., and I don't want to wake up earlier than I have to. So I'll see you on Monday. Goodbye.